if you get stuck on anything, let me know. We can take a second to make sure everybody is able to get everything working. So there's some tutorials here. We can ignore these. I'm just going to X out of here. And what we're going to do is just create a new project. And so this is going to open us up to the default interface. And like all the other Adobe products that we've looked at, if I want to change this interface, I can go to the workspace, and you can see we're set on default. But there's other things that we might use. So there's like an animation workspace that's kind of similar. There's, if we want to do some effects, that brings up this effects control window. If I want to do some motion tracking, that brings up some different windows that I might use. And then if I want to go back to the default, I can always just go back to default. And I can move these panels around. So if I decide, I want to move my info over here, and then I decide later that I don't want to do that, I can go back to workspace and reset default. And that'll bring me back to how it looks when I open it up. All right, so the first thing I want to do is save my project so I don't lose any of my work. So I'll just hit Command S. I guess I have to do Command Shift S because I can't save because I haven't actually done anything. So we'll do Save As, Command Shift S. And I'm going to make a new project. So if I have this dialog window, I want to make sure I'm in my correct folder. So I'm going to open it up using the little drop down and go to Desktop, go to MMP 100. And so I'm going to create a new folder. So I hit Command Shift N, but you can click New Folder and say Animation. And I'll just call this Animation Demo and click Save. Okay. Is everybody good so far?
No, I'm just going to that. Will I start a new project?
Yeah.
Okay.
That looks fine. So just you can do Command Shift S or Save As. You can call it whatever you want. It's just we're just doing a little demo today. Yeah, that's fine. Oh, it looks like that already exists. Okay. We're using After Effects.
After.
Everybody else is good? All right. So with our interface, it's a bit similar to Photoshop, but there's a couple differences because we're working with time more in this case, obviously with animation. So our main window down here is where we're going to be doing most of the work. This is our timeline. The composition is a preview of what we're going to see. The project area over here is where we're going to create folders and files and stuff like that. And then there's a bunch of stuff in this right-hand area, some basic info, and then things like effects, libraries, all this stuff that we probably won't get to today. So to get started, we need a composition. And so I can create a composition from footage. This is if I was doing some post-processing on some video, I could load a video in here and then use that as my basis. But we don't have any content to start with, so I'm just going to click New Composition. And this is where we're going to set all of our settings. So there's some presets here. And so HDTV is fine. We can stick with that. You can see there's a bunch of other presets for different file types. So for film, there's 2K and 4K if we were working on like a professional film project. These NTSC are old, and PAL are old TV standards. So if you were making something for TV for some reason, you would choose one of those. But for modern projects, like stuff that we're going to publish on the web, the HDTV 1080 29.97 is a fine place to start, so I'm just going to leave that as is. And then you can see the default for that is 1920 by 1080. That's the kind of default video standard for pretty much all video these days. We haven't fully converted to 4K yet, so we'll stick with that. So you really don't have to change any of these settings for the most part. Let's see what else is here. So there's a duration, 30 seconds. We're only working with 10 seconds. It can be longer, but I'll just set that back to 10. And then we could change the background color if we want. Black is fine, I think. So I'm just going to click OK. And so that's going to add in this new composition into our project. So you can see when I have the composition selected, it gives me some information about it. If I want to change the name of the composition, I can just click on, oh, can't double click. Maybe I click up here. Okay, so yeah, I have to right click on it and I can rename it. So I'm just going to call this demo 1. And so a composition is kind of like a layer where it has like different components in it, and we can layer those components together. And we can also put compositions inside of other compositions. So it also behaves a little bit like a scene in a video or something like that. So when I have my composition open, there's no actual content in here. So I have to add some content in here. One thing that you may want to do is create some folders. So for this demo, we probably really don't need folders, but if you have a bigger project, you are going to want to have folders. So normally I'll do this whenever I'm starting a new project. I'll create a new folder. So if I right click in this window, I can create a new folder. I can also just click on the folder button there if I want to add it that way. And usually what I'll start with is my compositions. And then I'll have a source folder. So if I have some video or like a Photoshop file or an Illustrator file that I want to use as a source, I'll usually put stuff like that in there. So then I'm going to open up this demo. And we're just going to add a couple really simple elements today. We're not going to do anything too crazy. So to add elements into my composition, I can right-click inside the timeline and add different things here. So I can add text, a solid. I can do 3D stuff in here with lights and cameras. I can do a shape layer, adjustment layer. So there's a lot of things that are similar to Photoshop. I'm going to start with a solid. And so a solid is basically just a color that's going to fill up the background. So I can make a solid. Maybe I'll fade into like a white background, maybe like a light gray.
You can choose any color.
Yeah, yeah, you can choose whatever color. So where it says color here, so if you create the solid, so if I right click, go to new, go to solid, there's a color section at the bottom. And it's kind of hard to see because the default color is gray. But if you click on that, it brings up the color chooser. And I'll do maybe like a light blue or something like that. And so if I click OK, now we get this light blue background. I could also, if I want to add it, another way to add is using the menu. I can go to Layer and go to New. And I have the same options up here. Okay, so we'll do a little fade. We'll fade into our scene. So we'll set that up in a second. Any questions? Is everybody able to add in a solid? Okay. So let's make this fade in. And this is where we're going to start to see the real tools of After Effects and animation. Oh, look, it actually made a solids folder for me with this solid in it. So normally I would put this in my source folder, but since it created this solids folder for me, I'll just leave that as is. Eventually, if I had a lot of stuff in here, I might put like the solids inside the source. But I'm not going to have a ton of stuff in here, so it's not really necessary. Okay, so we can see the timeline here. There's nothing really on here, but you can see this is 0 and that's 10. And this red bar indicates the timeline for this layer. So if I actually make this smaller, like if I go like this, now the solid isn't there until I get to here. So I can edit the layer timeline using this little red bar. And the green line that's above that shows you what's been pre-rendered. So as you're working on the animation, as you add more and more stuff in there, rendering out that stuff is going to take more time for the computer. And so you'll start to see the green bar will go away when we add something, and then it's going to pre-render it. And so then when we preview it, it's going to play back that render. So that's what the green bar indicates. So let's actually add some stuff in, and then we'll look at the other components of the interface. So back over here, we have some of the same buttons for our layers. So if I turn off this eyeball on and off, if I lock the layer, I'm not going to be able to make changes to it. I forget what this thing does. Oh, this is solo. So if I want to see just one part of my animation, I can solo a layer. Then I have some other stuff over here that we'll talk about later. And yeah, we'll talk about this stuff later on. So then for my animation, what I really need to do is look at inside of here, clicking on this little arrow, and then inside of this transform. And that's where we see the properties of each one of our components in our animation, and those are the things that we can animate. So you can see there's all these different numbers, we can animate all this stuff. We're just gonna start with fading in, and so we're gonna use this guy, our opacity. So just click on the little arrow here, so you see transform, and then the arrow here, so you see all the properties. Does everybody see that? So if you have a solid here, click on the little arrow next to the solid color. Okay. Also, real quick, that little red dot, if I want to change the color that I see over here, and also the points up here, I can click on that to change the color. So I'll stick with red, that's fine for now. So another thing that you can do that will make your process a little bit faster is there are a bunch of different key commands. So if I hit, what is the key command for opacity? I thought it was, let me see, is it? Oh, it's T, okay. So if I hit T, that's a key command for opacity. It'll just show me the opacity by itself. If I hit P, it'll show me position. R is rotation. A is anchor point. S is scale. And that's it. So if I only want to look at one property at a time, I can hit P, R, S, T is, I guess T stands for transparency, but that brings up opacity. But anyway, that's one way to make your workflow a little bit faster. But I'm just going to leave this open for now so we can all see where it is. And so we're going to change the opacity of this solid and then make it fade in. So you can see the opacity value right now is 100%. And if I move it down to 0%, it's completely transparent. So we see through to the black background. And what I want to do is I want to animate that property over time. And the way I animate things is using this little keyframe button right here. So when I click on this little watch, you can see it added this blue diamond here. It's kind of hard to see. You can move the playhead a little bit, and you should see there's a little blue diamond that when I click the keyframe, it's going to add it where my playhead is. And so what I want to do, so the first thing you do is set the opacity to 0, and then click the stopwatch to add in that keyframe. If I click it again, it'll take it out. So I want to add in that keyframe, and then I want to move my playhead to 2 seconds. once I have the playhead at 2 seconds, I want to move the opacity back up to 100. And then I want to add the keyframe again, but After Effects could tell that I was changing something, and so it went ahead and it added in that keyframe for me. And so now I have a little fade animation. And so to view that animation, I can just hit the play or the space bar to play. And now we can see that little fade in. And so now I have these keyframes. If I want my fade in to be shorter.
So you click the keyframe again after you put it 2 seconds?
Wait, how did you get it to fade? Because I have it at 2 seconds also for it.
Okay, let me do it again. So I'm going to delete these keyframes and drag my playhead back to 0. Okay, so I want to start, so I'm fading something in, so I want to start at 0 opacity. So I'm going to set the opacity down to 0. And I'm going to click the stopwatch to add a keyframe. Okay. So now I want to move the playhead to where I want the fade in to end. So I'm going to go to 2 seconds. So I'm just going to move this little blue guy up here. That's the playhead. And then since I've already added a keyframe, I don't have to click the stopwatch button again. I just have to change the value. So once I change the value, After Effects is going to see I already have a keyframe on this channel, and I'm changing the value. So I'm going to add another keyframe and then interpolate between the two.
Yours say seconds. Mine doesn't say seconds. It just says frame.
So you're probably zoomed in a little bit. You have a wider timeline than I do, so you can see more detail. But you can see that's 1 second, that's 2 seconds. So change the value of the opacity, and it'll add the keyframe for you. 100. Okay. Okay, so your composition is 40 seconds long, and so to zoom in, just drag this blue thing back, so then you can see more detail. Yeah, that's super. So this is frames. Okay, seconds. So that's 11 seconds. Oh, so you have to actually, yeah, sorry, go in more. Okay, this is. Wait, can you right click on your composition? On the, that's the folder. Can you right click on the composition? Yeah. Right click. Go to settings. Oh, okay. Make sure your start time code is 0. Yeah. You don't want to start at 10 seconds. And the duration do 10 seconds. Okay, so then drag that back up. Okay, so now you can see 1. So 10F is 10 frames, but this 1 is 1 second, and that's 2 seconds. Yeah. Yeah, move the keyframe back to 0 first. Yeah, and then move the playhead to 2. Yeah, and then change the opacity to 100. Okay.
Yeah, I was submitting that audio thing.
Right click in the bottom window and go to New Solid and change the color to whatever you want. Click OK on the color first. And click OK. And then opacity so you can see the opacity. So change the 100 to 0. And then click on the little watch to make a keyframe. Okay, and then move the playhead to 2 seconds. And change the opacity to 100.
For some reason, mine is showing frames as well, and not really seconds.
Yeah, so this is 10 frames, 20 frames, 1 second. And then 1 plus 10 plus 20, 2 seconds. Okay. What's the background of your composition?
It's solid.
Oh, you have the layer open. X out the layer. Yeah, and then try it again.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. All right, so a couple things I noticed. So you guys have a bigger timeline than I do. So I was going to go over this after we added a second layer, but let's do it now. So on my timeline, what you see is just 0 seconds, 1 second, 2 seconds. But if I zoom in a little bit, it adds some more detail. So what a lot of you guys are seeing looks like this, where it's 0 and then 10F, 20F, and then this is 1 second. So the F stands for frames. And so this is like 10 frames, 20 frames, and then it goes to 1 second. Then it's 1 second plus 10 plus 20, 2 seconds. So even though it shows the F at the end, where you see 1, 0, 0, that's 1 second. And if I zoom in even more, you see more frames. So 5 frames, 10 frames, 15, 20, 25, 1 second. If I zoom in even more, then eventually you'll see each frame. But I don't know, let's see what 1 second looks like. So it still says 1F under 1 second. So you can use this little top bar here to zoom in to different parts of the composition. And I can move it around as well. I'll go over more ways to work with that later, but we're still just doing the basics. This guy will change where I'm playing through. So I can loop a certain area of my animation for the playthrough. So if I only want to watch the beginning, I can move this guy down here. And then when I play, it's going to repeat that section. So if I want to focus on a particular part of my composition, I can use this. The top one is for zooming in. There's also a little scale button here, so I can zoom in or zoom out. And if I'm zoomed in a lot, I have this new little scroll wheel down here that I have to move back and forth to see the whole thing. If you see weird numbers, you may have changed the start position. So if you click on your composition and go to right-click, composition settings, if your start time code is anything other than 0, that means the numbers are going to be offset by that value. So you want your start time code just to be 0. For the duration, a lot of you guys just have it on the default 30 seconds. That's fine. If you have it on 10 seconds, then you have a little less timeline to worry about. So I recommend doing it on 10 seconds. You could even do it, shorter than that. But I think those settings are the best. For this demo, if you have something different here, you can just change it here and click OK. All right, so let's go back to our fade in. Any other questions? Okay. So let's just wrap up a couple things, and then I'll give you guys some time to play around with them. So we have our little fade in. As I mentioned, that green bar shows that it's rendered, which means that we can play it back. Okay. So now that I have these keyframes, I can move them. Okay, so if I want to get rid of keyframes for whatever reason, I just click the watch again and they go away. But I can also move the keyframes. So for example, If I want my fade in to be faster, I would select the right keyframe. So it's kind of hard to see, but if I have this keyframe selected, it's blue. If I click outside, they're both gray. If I click the right keyframe, I can now move it closer, and that makes my fade in animation shorter. If I want it to be longer, I can drag it out to 3 seconds, and we get a longer animation. If I want it to start later, I can move my first keyframe in. So now I'll just have black, and then the fade in starts. So you can move those keyframes around to get different effects. Okay, let's do a little fade out, and then we'll add another thing in here. So if I want to do a fade out, I can go all the way to the end of my composition, and now I can just change the opacity back to 0. So now I have a keyframe, but the problem is it's going to be fading out the whole time from 2 seconds all the way to 10 seconds. But what I really want is a fade out at the very end. So what I can do is move the playhead to 9. And there's a couple things I can do here. I can just set the opacity back to 100. But I can also grab this keyframe, copy, and then paste. So I didn't actually move the playhead. I just took the keyframe I know is what I want, and I did Command C to copy. And you can see it says copied 1 keyframe. And then when I paste, it's going to put it wherever my playhead is. So if I hit Command V, now I get this keyframe over here. So now we have a nice fade in, and then we just have the solid for a little while, and then we get the fade out. Okay, so we're going to add one more layer to play with. Any questions on that? All right. So I'm going to make this layer a little bit smaller, and then I'm going to right-click and go to Shape Layer. So a shape layer is an empty layer like in Photoshop where we can add shapes or drawings or text or whatever we want up here. So it's kind of just like a Photoshop layer. I could add, whoops, use paint. Okay. Oh, I have to go to a different panel. Okay, I don't want to do that right now. I'm just going to use a shape. So this is just like Photoshop. I can, go in here and find different types of shapes. I'm just going to start with a rectangle, and I'm just going to put a big rectangle right here, and go back to my selection tool. So I have a bunch of tools up here that are like my Photoshop and Illustrator tools. So now I have this shape. I can change the fill. Let's change the fill to something a little less bright, maybe like pink color. That looks kind of nice. Okay. And I can change the stroke, so I can turn off the stroke if I want. I guess I can set the stroke to 0. So now I just have this rectangle. Let's lock up my solid so I don't keep moving it. So I'm going to put a little lock on the solid. So now I have this little pink rectangle. And so now I can animate different properties of this rectangle. For some reason it's doing weird. I don't know why. It's kind of weird. I don't know why it's moving like that. I'm going to delete this and make a new one. I think I screwed it up at some point. Okay. Here's a rectangle. I'm going to go back to the selection tool. There we go. Now it's acting normal. Okay. So I can animate pretty much all of the various properties of this rectangle that I want to animate. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. I'm going to make the rectangle animate onto the screen. Okay. So I'm going to start over here, and I'm going to move the rectangle all the way over here. And I'm going to click on the rectangle over here. And there's a lot of properties in here, so it gets a little bit confusing to look at. Let's make this a little bit bigger. So I can animate aspects of the rectangle path, which is the stroke around the rectangle. I can animate the stroke itself, like the color, the opacity, the width, all of these different things. I can animate the fill, so that's the color, opacity. So I have like a lot of different things that I can animate here. I can also animate the transform of the rectangle, and I can also animate the transform of the whole layer. So there's like a lot of different levels to what I can animate. So we want to try to keep things relatively simple here. So I'm just gonna close my rectangle contents and just work with the transform of my layer. And so I have a position here. Oh, but it's still set to the middle. Okay, actually, let's work with the rectangle. Yeah, because I don't want to. Okay, so never mind. We're going to ignore the transform. We're going to go to contents, rectangle, and then open the transform of rectangle 1. And here we can see the position is negative 1400, negative 200. Doesn't really matter what it is. We're just going to click our stopwatch to create a keyframe here. And now let's animate the rectangle into our composition. So I'm going to move the playhead over a little bit, and then I'm just going to drag the rectangle over here. And so now it's going to animate between those two values. So we can edit this a little bit. I have a lot of stuff open, so I'm going to close this stuff. And now notice if I move this layer, the keyframes move with it. So I'm going to make this layer a little bit shorter just so I can see the whole thing. So if I move the layer over here, those two keyframes also move. So now my rectangle comes in where I move it. I can also move the keyframes independently. So I have a lot of different options here. I'm going to move this over here. And this is kind of a lot of information to look at. So remember, I can isolate certain things. So if I hit P, that's the position of my layer. How do I get the position of my rectangle? Let's see. Forgot. I'm just going to Google it real quick. After Effects, key command, position inside of rectangle. Okay. I don't see an answer for this, so I'm just going to ignore it for now. Okay.
Did you also change its opacity or just the position?
I just changed the position. So we can also change things like the rotation and the scale. So I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to keyframe the scale. And I'm going to scale it down a little bit, actually. And so now when I go here, I can scale it up, and it's going to do both of those animations at the same time. And if I wanted to rotate, I can do that as well. So I can go back here and click on the rotation, and then go here and rotate around 180 degrees. And so now it's going to do all of those at the same time. And it's kind of slow, so let's grab these keyframes. So if I want to edit multiple keyframes, I can drag across the keyframes like that, and then I can move all of them. So if I want to make that animation faster, I can move these keyframes closer to where they come in. So let's actually move this. I'm going to collapse all this stuff and move this over here so it comes in after our fade in. Okay. So we only have like 15 minutes in class left, so I'm going to stop there and give you guys some time to play around with it. You can see there's a lot of different possibilities and features and properties, so it could be a little bit overwhelming. I would say just like play around with one of these rectangles or shapes and just try all of the different properties and see what it looks like. And for now, don't worry about creating something that actually looks good. Just try seeing what you can get with these properties. Okay, so I'm going to save this. I'm